And we are live. How's everyone doing? We're going to be talking today about New Year's resolutions, specifically related to reading, but we're also going to be talking a little bit about prayer. Because we find ourselves at the end of a very difficult year. A lot of us have been locked in rooms for months, and even if they're not NEETs, have kind of been living the NEET life. Right, like I'm a graduate student, but I've never actually gotten the opportunity to go to university. So I've been stuck in this room for quite a while, and I suspect many of you are going through the same. And so I figured maybe it would be a good idea to get some schedule back into my life, but also yours. Because although I have schedules for prayer and things like that, there isn't much really beyond that. And I thought that I would do some work. And I figured that you guys might benefit from that work. That feeling when you have no reading list for us this year. Well, you see, that's where things are different, because I actually do have a reading list for you. And I'll explain why I've made this particular reading list. So, and we're going to talk about two reading lists today. We're going to talk about the list that I have made, which is for the Church Fathers, which is, as far as I know, the first day-to-day patristic reading list on the entire internet. I might be wrong, but that's as far as I know. Basically, for those people who don't have access to, say, the Divine Office, because it's too expensive, because that has readings, or also want something more in-depth in the Church Fathers. And then I've got another one, which is going to be Bible reading, which is something that people should do if they have a reasonable grounding in theology, but I wouldn't just throw the average person at, because if you're going to be reading through something like Leviticus or Numbers, and I'll get onto this later in the stream, you're going to be faced with some confusing things that you're going to need to spend a lot of time resolving. The time spent with Bible reading is often deceptive, because you can spend, say, the average length for the... Let me give you an example, right? So the average reading on the patristic list, which I'm going to show you, is around an hour. Maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less in some cases, different than others, right? The average reading for the Bible is about 20 minutes, but the thing is there's a lot more legwork you have to put into it, because a lot of things aren't immediately clear and may actually cause scrupulosity. Did you make any effort to connect these readings to the lectionary? No, I didn't. So, I am going to quickly grab the... Okay, it should be back now. It should be back. So yeah, it did just actually crash. That is astonishing. Okay. Right, so let's try this again. If I drop out again, you know what it is. 3, 2, 1, go. There we go, it worked this time. Okay, so I can actually hear it. I don't know why it crashes it sometimes. I think I need to maybe get some sort of fix on that. Yeah, so I've produced, and you can get these both in the descriptions. In the description, one. Well, this isn't actually mine. This is from a pre-existing Catholic church. I think it's like St. Mary's or something or other that made this. But I made this yesterday and today. This took me about... It took me a substantial amount of time to put together. And basically the aim of this is to get you very well grounded in the Fathers for like a year. You're not going to read all of the Fathers. There are simply too many. There's something like 250 volumes in total, and not all of those are translated. This isn't even going to put a dent into that. But it will give you an idea of what you're doing. So the idea is that you will read each of these particular parts of certain writings, and when you're done for the day, you tick the box. And then when you're done for the second day, you tick the box. And when you're done for the third, you guessed it, you tick the box. These will cover all of the eras of the church from the throughout the entire patristic era, which begins with, I suppose you would say, the ascension of Jesus. and ends with St. John of Damascus at the close of the 8th century AD. And that it's a pretty broad-ranging survey of all of the fathers, both East and West, in rather exhaustive detail. And you can get all of these writings that I have placed here for free. I have made sure that I have picked writings that are free, because I know that these books can sometimes be very expensive, and there are sometimes academic paywalls and things like that for some of them. So, for example, you won't see many of the more obscure people, maybe like Jacob of Sarug or anything like that. But there are, the best known ones are covered in quite a lot of detail. Like, you will come to know St. John Chrysostom and St. Augustine of Hippo very, very well in this reading list. But okay, so like one thing I would like to say before any of you decide to take this up, because I'm going to be starting this with the new year, and I already know a bunch of people who are going to be taking this up in the new year. If you aren't praying already, pray, because you're going to need it to really get into the writings. So if you aren't praying a rosary every day already, do that first. Ideally, you would be praying the rosary every day before you read into this, and preferably some other prayer as well, maybe mental prayer. And in fact, this list will teach you quite a lot about mental prayer, because there's also a lot of spiritual reading here as well. So it will help you not only develop a good theological understanding of Christianity, it's going to give you the history, it's going to give you the martyrdoms, it's going to give you the lives of the saints, and it's going to give you the spiritual teaching. There is not a single topic, as far as I'm aware, besides maybe the canon of the Bible, that isn't covered somewhere in these lists. And even then, I suspect that there's probably some stuff in there from Jerome or something like that. So I'm going to check the questions very quickly. Like if you want to ask questions, go ahead and stick them in the chat. Will this reading list include pseudepigraphic works? Yeah, it does actually, Anisodemus. It includes, at one point, the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, which is a Christian, supposedly, pseudepigraphic work of the 1st, 2nd century AD. The scholars disagree. Which basically provides a bunch of testaments by the 12 children of Jacob on specific moral topics. There's also the Proto-Evangelion of James, which is on Mary's childhood, Joseph the Carpenter, which is on Joseph, and a bunch of other works that didn't quite make it into the New Testament, like the First Epistle of Clement. So Matthew Barry asks, just use Sci-Hub and download the PDF, just fire the link as away as you go. It's in the description. I'm using a Discord link currently, so if you guys just click on that, it'll give you the PDF. I'll talk very quickly about the Bible one, because there's really much less to say. I'm going to give a sort of an overview of the fathers that are on this list, and give details for you fellas. But we're going to talk about the Bible very quickly. I use this chronological plan. This gives you Bible readings every single day, and it gives you... The idea is that you've read the entire Catholic Bible in 1 year. And I can tell you from experience it's pretty good. It takes you about 20 minutes a day. Now, I'm about here. One thing that is probably the case for both of them is that you are going to miss days out. Don't worry too much about that. Just keep going. And, you'll get through the scriptures. One of the difficulties, and this is why it's kind of deceptive, it takes about 20 minutes to read these, but to actually understand some of the strangenesses in, say, Leviticus and Numbers, it takes quite a lot of research to actually understand them. So I would say it could add 40 minutes on top of that, maybe even more. Particularly, for example, when you get to Leviticus and Numbers and they start talking about perpetual commandments, and then you have to look them up and you realize that it's a little bit of a deceptive translation, because the Hebrew is olam and the Greek is aion, which refers to the current age. And so you might get scrupulous thinking, oh, Jesus didn't fulfill this part of the law. And he does. Granted, they're expressed in different ways as you'd expect from disciplines. But when it means perpetual command, from what I've read, it means of the current age, for the entire age. And Christ begins a new age because he starts the new creation. In fact, this is an important reason why we start this reading list with stuff that reconciles the Old Testament and the intertestamental on quote period with the New. That is why you will start in the homilies and discourse bit going through the epistle to the Hebrews from the point of view of St. John Chrysostom, because Hebrews is one of these letters. It's an anonymous letter. Some people say it's written by Paul, some people say that it's simply anonymous. This is one of those letters that reconciles the Old and New Testament. Also, you have the Epistle of St. Clement, which does something similar. And finally, you have the dialogue with Trypho, which is a dialogue between St. Justin Martyr, who was the first large-scale Christian apologist that we have records of, debating with, I think he was a rabbi called Trypho. And this lays bare all of the fulfillments of the Old Testament that Martyr was aware of, as well as an explanation as to why we don't actually follow the old law. Now, of course, these differences are even more pronounced than they were in Justin Martyr's day, because it's become very clear if you flick through the Old Testament that rabbinical Judaism is really nothing like it. It lacks all of the sacrifices because they don't have a temple, and in fact they're incapable of fulfilling the old law precisely because of this. But in, say, I think it was 150 AD, the temple had been destroyed for about 3 generations, so it wasn't quite as clear. So it will really benefit you to go over that. Let's see if there's any questions here. Are you happy with the Brexit you got? Also, what do you expect to happen in the UK next year? Riots and civil unrest. I expect civil unrest. I'm not particularly happy with the Brexit, but frankly there are bigger concerns at this moment. You're going to read these. How could you make a reading list without having read the books? Why did you decide on those books? I've read some of the books. A lot of the books I never finished. So, for example, I've read parts of City of God, and I've read, I'd say, a good half, maybe a bit more than half, of Confessions. I've also read bits of Against Heresies, and I know that they're good works. And I know from reading later theologians that they're extremely important. I also know from friends that a lot of these homilies from St. John Chrysostom are very good. I actually read his letters to St. Olympia, and they're incredible. So I know that he's a good writer. They even call St. John Chrysostom the second Paul, which is why later on in the schedule we go through his homilies on Romans and on Ephesians, because he knows Paul really well. I've also got him here on Acts. A lot of these books I've read as well, like I've read on the spiritual law. I can tell you this is incredible. Text on discrimination, likewise. I've read most of the Rule of St. Benedict. But, not everything I have read. I don't know much about Contra Celsum beyond the fact that it's extremely important. I haven't finished... A lot of these works I've taken bites out of, but I never completely finished. And a lot of them are things that I know are extremely important just from knowing the way that other saints talk about them. Dialogue of Trypho isn't one of them, though. I just think that having a very strong understanding as to why Christianity not only developed on top of Old Testament Israelite religion, but is also distinct from Judaism, is extremely important. Especially if you're going through the Bible, the Old Testament. So this is kind of as almost a preparation for this. Because if you just open this up, you're going to get quite confused and have to put in a lot more legwork than is immediately obvious. What method of selection was used in the making of this list? So I basically just picked it around what I thought people needed. And as I said, there needs to be an understanding as to why Christianity not only follows on legitimately from Old Testament Israelite religion, but also is distinct from Judaism. That's an important thing. There also needs to be an understanding of the interactions of God's grace with free will, which is why I have St. Augustine further down here on that. There also needs to be an understanding of the ancient heresies. So, for example, those people who say that the Old Testament God was evil and the New Testament God was good. We have a huge selection from Tertullian refuting this particular heresy with some like additional caveats called Marcionism, which had a lot more to it than that, but that's the crux of what it's known for. A lot of it is spiritual writings. So, in contemporary modern culture, when people think of spiritual, they think of New Agey stuff. A huge chunk of this reading list is just going to chew up the New Age thought that is very dominant at the moment. Maybe not explicitly, but is nonetheless. That is one of the things this is going to address. Also, just having an idea of history, I have all of the ecumenical councils, all of their proceedings here. So you're going to go through and read them between day 275 and day 307. So you're going to get a good month of ecumenical council reading just to get an idea of what went on at these councils and the particular canons that were instilled there. Also, I put a nice note here because it's important to remember you'll see disciplinary changes in these ecumenical councils, and those things aren't binding necessarily. So if you get freaked out, for example, at, say, the Council of Nicaea, where people aren't allowed to kneel, that's not something to worry about, that's disciplinary. Cam and Cam had a chart of all the Greek writers sorted by the amount of their extant works, and Chrysostom came out on top. Yeah, Chrysostom wrote a huge amount. A huge chunk of this is Chrysostom. Thoughts on Vigano's recent letter saying the current tyranny is preparing us for the rule of Antichrist and cites the prophecy of Daniel. I don't pay much attention to Vigano, that's all I'll say. What I would also say, with regarding Cam and Cam, there's also a huge amount of Western fathers here. So Augustine is the one that wrote the most, and he's followed by, not Tertullian, Jerome, and there's a lot of Jerome here as well. Like, you're going to go through Jerome's commentary on Daniel at one point, because he actually responds to Porphyry's critique that Daniel is history quite succinctly, and frankly I think that people who believe that Daniel is history are kind of coping. As Dr. Brant Petrie points out in the book that I will never get tired of mentioning, The Catholic Introduction to the Old Testament. So anybody who tries to tell you that Daniel is history, ignore them. Because they are wrong, and it forces them to balk the text to actually get to that conclusion. Now, what else is there that I'd like to pay attention to? Someone pointed out that I have the works of Origen on here. And Origen is one of these people who was incredibly important to the church's development, but also held some strange heresies. So he held to what is known as the pre-existence of souls, where souls pre-exist their bodies, right? This is anathematized. And he also held to universalism. At least this is what his writings said. He held to what was formerly known as apocastasis, which is considered universalism now in English, but basically it means that even the demons will be saved. Not just the damned, but the demons will be saved. That is why I've included on here his anathematization in the ecumenical councils on those specific points. But the fact that we still have a lot of Contra Celsus copies floating around should tell you that not everything he wrote was bad. In fact, one of the people who's very big on here, well, not very big, but is on here, Gregory of Nyssa, relies on him quite strongly. Will you make a video on why the term Judeo-Christian is a meme? I mean, probably not. I mean, we clearly live very, very different religion. We have very different religions. I'll leave it at that. Thoughts on Luke Smith? Like the guy. Yeah, I like him. I like his stuff. There's not really much for me to say beyond that. Anyway, this is just a short stream. Really, this was only going to be a really short stream just to let you guys know what was going on with this thing, because I spent, I wrote this thing up and I thought that I would provide it for you. And one request I would have you to do is to share this list with anybody who wants an understanding of Christianity at all, because it's very, very tempting for people to just open up the Bible and start reading. And if you do that, you're going to come to all kinds of crazy misunderstandings. And you're going to end up making mistakes like, for example, thinking that the mixing of fabrics is still a moral law. It's not. Also, this is a mistake, but it doesn't matter. It's actually 800 AD, but hey-ho. It was originally going to be 500 AD, but I ran out of writings, so I expanded it out a bit. Besides the point. Yeah, this is more for people who... I would suggest, personally, reading this first before you go and read the Bible, because this will ground you in how the texts are actually interpreted, and this will give you the texts themselves, so you've got this sort of framework to work from. This will also explain parts of the New Testament and the Old Testament as well explicitly. So, this is a huge collection of commentaries on the Gospel of John by St. Augustine of Hippo, and then there's commentaries on Paul's letters and the Apocalypse, the Prophecy of Daniel by Jerome and stuff like that, right? You read this to get an understanding of the text, and then when you're reading the Bible, you go like, oh, okay, this makes sense. So, for example, the bread of the presence in Numbers 4, right? It is wrapped. It sits on a blue sheet, and then has, I think it's a red and then a purple sheet wrapped over it, and that's very important because there's a supposed biblical contradiction wherein Jesus wears a red, well, specifically a scarlet sheet in two of the Gospels, and he wears a purple one in another one, right? This isn't a contradiction. Seeing the similarity between Numbers 4 and those variants in the text made me pretty sure that there was some sort of coordination between the writers of the three Gospels, which we already kind of know. But a lot of modern biblical critics assume that these are just anonymous stories. But I think this is one of those things where this falls apart, because it fits perfectly with this part of the law, which is clearly prefiguring Jesus, because in the Hebrew, the bread of the presence is the bread of the face, which is the face of God, and is seated upon blue, which is also the same thing that God is seated upon, which is sapphire. So I don't think that the anonymous writings thing is something that you can really push. But that's just me rambling. I would start with this first and then move on to the Bible, but it's obviously your choice. What do you mean by Daniel isn't history? It's prophecy. So there's a bunch of higher biblical critics, as they call themselves. I'm not sure I call them that myself. But they believe that the prophecy of Daniel was written during the Maccabean War of the 2nd century BC. And they cite things like historical discrepancies, and they cite the fact that it's so incredibly accurate as a reason for this. The problem is that in order to actually do this, they have to balk history themselves and ignore evidence. Like, for example, this is actually in a biblical commentary by a Catholic author, Raymond Brown. I'm not sure if he specifically wrote this himself, but he said one of the commentaries on Daniel says that Daniel 5 is fiction. This is false. The reason they say that it's fiction is because they say that there's no record in any of the writers that Belshazzar was ever king of Babylon. The trouble is that we have archaeological evidence proclaiming that Belshazzar had kingship. So this is actually false. And there's all kinds of things like this. Google Ngrams exposes the JC lie as well. Nobody said until last Thursday, aside from it was briefly used by converts. Used for converts. What are you referring to, Stephen? I'm kind of curious. Daniel's prophecies are yet to happen. I may be wrong on that. No. Daniel's prophecies happen. In fact, they actually predict the crucifixion of Jesus to the year. They're extremely accurate. And that's what convinced Porphyry in the 3rd century that they were history. Or rather, he suggested they were history. But the trouble is that in order to make them history, you have to balk it very strongly, and you have to go in the face of every single Christian and Jewish commentator on the Book of Daniel. There's a lot of very serious problems with that particular interpretation. Oh, Judeo-Christian. Oh, I see. Oh, I thought you were referring to something scriptural, because I know that engrams is textual analysis. Anyway, I will leave you guys with that. I hope you find it useful. I will warn you, it will probably take you around about an hour to maybe an hour and a half a day to finish each of the writings. I mean, there are some that are shorter, like towards the beginning, you won't have to worry. It's more like half an hour, 45 minutes. But as you get revved up into the habit, the idea is that a habit will take 21 days to build. You will be reading more and more as time goes by. Just because that's the way I've structured it out. Not necessarily intentionally, but that's how it's come out in the grand scheme. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoy that. And I will be talking on Settlers Laments channel in about an hour and 5 minutes if you guys want to tune in there. So I'll see you guys later, and goodbye.